parlor game. I don't really know exactly how it works, but I think it's you make three statements and one of them is true, and you have to figure out which one the true is. And so the point is trying to figure out things about people you don't know. Well, there's a fact about me that I'm pretty sure nobody in this room knows, except my wife knows. And the fact is that back in the 80s, I self-published a little booklet and actually sold it, put an ad in the back of a sporting magazine of some kind. I forget what the issue was. And the title of the brochure was How to Build and Set Box Traps. And I think it was called Trap 'em Alive or something was my name of my little booklet. So in this little booklet that I created, there was a section on how to construct these different sizes box traps, from real small ones that would catch mice up to ones large enough to catch a coyote. And I went through all the different trapping techniques as far as the triggers and things. And then there was a section on habitat, where to go to look for different kinds of animals and how to watch for them, tracks and things. And there was a section on bait, a whole different chart on which baits works well in different animals. And all of that came from my experience growing up, because I grew up in the country, and behind our property there was quite a few hundred acres of forests and swamps, and I spent a lot of time out there hunting and trapping animals. And there were many, many mornings in junior high and high school where I'd get up before light and I would go wander through the woods and checking all my traps and be back in time to get ready to go to school. And it was just, thought I was a mountain man, so that was part of my life. So the point of all this is that in life there are things which trap and ensnare us. The Bible talks about traps and things which ensnare us, and these traps are carefully constructed according to our personality, according to our habitat, and they're often baited with ingredients which draw us into them. And the traps sometimes are constructed by our arch enemy, Satan, and his minions. Sometimes they are traps which simply are a part of our heritage, perhaps our upbringing. There are traps which sometimes are just simply a part of our environment. But all traps are designed to prevent us from enjoying life. The point is to capture us and to ensnare us and to prevent us from enjoying life to the fullest. One of the traps that was a part of my early life was food. I was addicted to food, and I don't know, about 15 years ago, maybe it was longer than that, I determined that this was something I wanted to have victory over, and so I started fasting one day a week. And I still do that, and I fast on Saturdays now, and it's, honestly, I've done it so long that it isn't an issue for me. I wake up in the morning, I know I'm going to fast, and I'm actually not even hungry. I don't even think about food all day long. It's just not a problem. Yesterday morning, I got up, and my wife started cooking bacon. And then after a while, she was getting ready for a guest. She wasn't being mean. She was getting ready for company later on in the day, and so she was getting, making this soup. And then after a little while, I smelled her grinding fresh coffee. And I thought, if that was still an issue for me, I would have been tempted. But quite honestly, it didn't affect me at all, because I have lots of years of working on that particular trap. And so I was sort of thinking about how Satan constantly tempts us to see if we're still doing okay in that area. And there are areas where you think, yeah, I've got this one under control, and then suddenly that bacon smell will come through. You know what I'm talking about? And man, you find yourself right in there again. Well, this morning, I want to talk through a passage in Matthew, and there are some groups of people that Satan used to try and trap and ensnare Christ. And let me tell you about the three groups of people before we actually get to the passage, so don't turn there yet. I want you to listen to what I'm saying. Basically, three different groups of people. There are the Pharisees, Sadducees, and what are called the religious leaders. The Sadducees were an aristocratic group of people. They were wealthy merchants and pretty much high-level people. And they were interested in religion primarily as it affected them economically. And, it was a great place to make social contacts, to get people signed up for a free cookbook or whatever, and come to your house and make a presentation of your camel dung remover. I don't know. So they were in it for the money, and they believed in God, but they didn't believe that there was anything after this life. They were pretty much deists, and they believed that God was there and had sort of got things going, but he didn't really have anything to do with us anymore. And so there was no eternity. There was nothing after this life. You just lived this life the best you could. And so they acknowledged the importance of religion simply because it was a social way in which they could interact and make more wealth, quite honestly. Another group were called the Pharisees, and the Pharisees. Oh, the other thing I should say about the Sadducees is that they basically just stuck to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, the Pentateuch, and that's basically all they looked at. They didn't look at anything else. They figured the prophets and the oral traditions, they didn't have any value. So you just look at the first 5 books. The Pharisees were a group of very humble, very religious practitioners, and they were ardent pursuit of God. They believed that God was involved in their life. They believed that there was eternity. And they believed that the law was the most important representation of how we connect to God, and it was through the rules and regulations of the law. And so their faith in God had become distorted from a personal faith based on relationship to one based upon works, very, very much works. And so works was so important that they took all of the laws from the first 5 books and the prophets, and they literally spent hundreds of years writing out every single instant they could think of and how people should respond to that. What exactly can you do on a Sunday? What is entitled work? Well, you can walk this far but no further. You can water your donkey, but you can't ride him. So there was just this constant list. So they spent all their days memorizing all of these rules and then telling the people what the rules were. And so there's this incredible bondage around them. In Jerusalem, there was a group of religious leaders called the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was sort of like the Jewish high court. It was a supreme court that ruled matters relating just to the Jews. They were under the Romans, and so anything that had to do with the Roman Empire was settled by Roman authorities, but if it was just a Jewish issue, then basically the Sanhedrin took care of it. The Sanhedrin is made up primarily of the Sadducees, although there are always a few Pharisees on there because the Pharisees were popular with the people. People liked the Pharisees because they were kind of the down-to-earth people. So they had to have a few Pharisees on there, but the Pharisees didn't really have a lot of weight as to what the Sadducees decided. And then there were another group called the religious leaders. Religious leaders were basically some Sadducees, some Pharisees, and anyone else that sort of was a leader. Some of those would be the priests. The high priest of the temple was somebody who was appointed by Rome. It was a political position. And then all the priests below them were appointed as well. In the Old Testament, all the priests had to be from the tribe of Levi, and they couldn't own property. They couldn't, it was a very restrictive job, and basically their whole life was committed to the temple. At the time of Christ, being a priest was an economic job. So you paid for this position, and it was very, very lucrative because your salary was based on the temple tax. And you know that when people came into the temple, they had to pay a temple tax. And there's a couple of stories about Jesus being confronted with a temple tax. And that's what it was for, to pay the salaries of the priests. And so the priests didn't really do anything. I mean, they offered some sacrifices and things. They did the functions of the temple. But it was very lucrative, and it wasn't a spiritual position. It was one that you bought into or somebody gave you as a favor for something you did. So those are the 3 groups. So these groups were all somewhat threatened by Christ one way or another because he was coming in and he was causing some confusion. He was causing some turmoil. And, we just read last week about how he went into the temple courts and started turning things around. And so everybody in those 3 groups were pretty upset with him. So we come to Matthew chapter 22. And I'm actually going to jump down. You can read the other part of the chapter if you get bored with my sermon. But I want to start with verse 15. And I'm just going to read the first section there. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay imperial tax? To pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarii. And he asked them, whose image is this and whose inscription? Caesar, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. So I'm just going to pause there for a minute and make a few observations, then we'll continue on. So the trap was that if he said, that, from their perspective, he said, no, you shouldn't pay that tax. It's extortion. Nobody should have to pay money to get into the temple. It's God's temple. Then he violated Roman law. And they could go to the Roman authorities and say, this guy said that people, he's in revolt. You should go arrest him. On the other hand, if he said that you should pay the tax, then he is basically undermining everything that he'd done the day before and going in there and turning over the tables. So that was the trap, and he very carefully eluded it. And I was thinking, so my point in all three of these was sort of to take the story and to see how it related to my life and what was the trap for me. I mean, I understand the trap for Jesus, but I sort of wanted to understand what the trap was for me. And relating to money, relating to my personal wealth is sort of where I'm going with this. And a couple weeks ago, we talked about the importance of our physical wealth, and we talked about tithing and how important it is to tithe, and the importance of giving money, because when we give our money, it illustrates to God that we trust Him, and it illustrates that God is more important to us than our money. And, giving our money should be separate than giving our time or anything else, because, that is the specific way in which, we care for ourselves. That's the way that we provide for ourselves. So giving that tithe, those offerings, illustrates a sense of dependency upon God and also a sense of generosity. But another area, another part of this whole connection to God through our security is through our possessions. And I don't think Hergits are here this morning, but most of you heard about the horrible thing that happened. They had a fire in their garage, and where all the tools are, which is the most valuable part of the house. But the worst part was, not only did his tools, a lot of them get burned up, but the furnace kicked on and sucked all the smoke and pumped it through the whole house. And so everything in the house was just completely inundated with smoke. And not only was it coated, but it smelled. And, they've been going through this horrific process for months trying to clean the whole house. And a week ago, they finally emptied the garage completely out, repainted it, and he was starting to put all of his tools back in there. And there was a part of me, as horrible as that was, there was a part of me that I heard that I thought, that would be nice. Because I stand in my garage, and it's full of stuff. And some of that stuff has been there since I built that garage. And I've never taken it off the shelf. But it's there because I may need to take it off the shelf one of these days. But it's there. And I was sitting there thinking about how our possessions so entangle us, and how we get so entangled by the things that we own. And in some senses, it would be nice to start over and not have anything, and then you'd have a sense of what really is important. And as Victor is putting things back in his garage, every possession he's evaluating. Is it worthwhile for me to spend the money on this? I haven't used it in 25 years. Why would I buy it now? Here's this thing I've been storing for 25 years. Is there any point in replacing it? I might as well wait until I need it and then buy it then. And clutter is something which literally psychologically affects every one of us. And there are parts of all of our lives, probably, maybe there's a few that's not true of, but most of us, if you're like me, that there's the clutter of possessions that trap you and prevent you from living life to the fullest. And that's what Satan's trying to do, is to not allow you to live life to the fullest. Moving on. That same day, the Sadducees, this is the other group, who say there's no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teachers, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offsprings for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died. Since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second, the third brother, right down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? Of the 7, since all of them were married to him. Jesus replied, You are in error because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what God said to you? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. So not only did Jesus take and disarm the trap, but he actually turned it around into a trap for them. And not only invalidated their argument, but pointed out the weakness of it as well. I was thinking about this, and maybe some of these are a stretch for you, but the trap for me was really human relationships. And in all of our lives, there are relationships which are good and healthy, and there are relationships which perhaps are not as healthy and not as good. And I think the trap, or the journey for us, is to take relationships and evaluate them and determine whether this is a relationship that needs to be cultivated, whether this is a relationship that needs to go in a different direction. What is this relationship doing in my relationship to God? This past week was a really, really stressful week for me. I had just a lot of things going on. I had to get some headway done on my sermon because I didn't have very much time yesterday to work on it. And in the midst of all that, someone called and asked me if I would rescue them. And I was thinking, oh man, this is the wrong week to rescue anybody. But they convinced me that I should do the rescuing. So I went to rescue this person, and I was sitting there starting with it, and I was grumbling, and I was complaining, and I was saying to God, I really should be home working on my sermon, not doing this. And God very clearly said to me, this is the sermon. And I stopped and I thought, yeah, this is the sermon. I'm living the sermon. Because sometimes people are what's most important. They're more important than studying and preparation and memorization. Sometimes it's time to set aside what I want to do and to serve someone else. And for some of you, the opposite may be true. Sometimes there are individuals that are so quick to serve others that they're not taking care of their family, or perhaps they're serving one people at the expense of someone else. So it's not a simple formula to say, do this and don't do that. But the trap is that we need to be very careful that we are allowing God to use relationships to minister and to build us and to give us opportunities to love other people. And that is the point of relationships. Relationships are not supposed to tear us down. They're supposed to give us and be a vehicle for us to share God's love and to love other people. Trap number 3. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and the Pharisees, Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment to the law? Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, "What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" "The son of David," they replied. He said to them, "How is it that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet.' Then if David calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one could say a word to him in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. What is the trap? This may be a bit of a stretch, but I was thinking about how difficult it is for us logically to explain God at times. I was listening to a report this past week about the millennials, who are the 18 to 30-year-olds right now. You're called millennials if you didn't know that. And they study all these different groups. What they found about the millennials is that 58% of them don't believe in God, which is astounding. It's just a remarkable increase. And I was thinking about that and thinking about why that would be. I was talking to a missionary in Africa one time, and I don't know how we got on the subject, but he said, there are no atheists in the continent of Africa, or very, very, very rare. And that's curious to me, because one of the reasons that people here give up on God is because the way people are suffering in the world, and that God is supposed to be a God of love, and yet he allows people to suffer. And yet the people who are in the midst of suffering never don't believe in God. They're the ones that are most adamant about the fact that there has to be a God, that God is the one. He's the only solution. He's the only answer. And so we sit in our area of comfort and we look and we say, well, God shouldn't be the way that he is. So I think the trap is that we feel like we have to explain God, that we have to answer all the questions about God, that we have to have a solution to all the puzzles about God. And I'm not in any way saying that we should disconnect our minds, because all people love to connect my mind, and I love to engage, and I love to try and figure things out. But there are some points that I come to that I say, I simply can't answer that. Maybe I will before I die. Right now I can't answer that. But I am determined that that will not be a trap that shakes my confidence in the reality of God. And I can always go back and look at all the evidences in my life that say God has to exist. God intervened in so many times in my life. I may not be able to answer how he relates to the rest of the planet, but I can certainly see how he's related to me. And the trap is to dwell too much on those unanswered questions, I believe, unanswerable questions, and to use them, to allow them to be fodder to cultivate in you a sense of doubt and discouragement and hopelessness that there is a God. And there is so much evidence to support him if you look in the right places as well. So the traps of life. Our enemy Satan knows you really, really well. He knows exactly where to put the traps. He knows exactly what the right bait would be. He knows exactly when and where to set it. He knows how to bring circumstances in such a way that you wander right in front of the trap, and he's waiting to trap you. I encourage you this morning to be wary of the traps. I want to pray for you. Before I do that, I want to invite you to stay for lunch. And we have lunch that we've provided. Some of you brought some stuff as well, but whether you brought something or not, there's ample lunch. And we're actually going to let the kids go through first, because they're going to take their lunch and go back and have Sunday school. So, but we need to stack all of these chairs right here, if you guys would help. And then if you're not in this section, we need to bring in the tables and set them up here. So, and maybe the music people can move the music stands out of the way. But let's stand together and